Hello, I'm Rod Peppiatt, minister in the Avenue Uniting Church in Blackburn, Victoria, on the Wurundjeri lands. Today marks the beginning of the new Christian year. It marks the beginning in the season that we call Advent, the time of 4 weeks that lead up to Christmas, a time when we reflect on the stories that announce the coming of God's chosen one. We claim the promise of Jesus, and a time when we think about and prepare ourselves for remembering that story once more at Christmas. And one of the ways in which we do that is to see in the scriptures the stories that point towards Jesus. One of which is found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 1. And you might find it useful, if you haven't got one of those near you, to stop the video for a moment. And I'll pause for you to do that and have that in front of you, because I'm going to attend to that in what we do. Reading from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 1. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Aram, Aram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. The account goes on, but in averting the risk of eyes glazing over, we're going to pick it up again at verse 16. And Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14. From David to the deportation in Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation in Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Quite apart from not being easy to read, that's not the most riveting of gospel passages, is it? It's a bit like the Pentecost story that happens in Acts chapter 2, where the names are this long and the reader for the day wonders who'll draw the short straw. It's like that, but not quite as interesting. Abraham, the father of Isaac, Isaac, the father of Jacob, etc., and on it goes. At least the older versions of the Bible had the word begat in them. And that was a bit of a highlight for a young fella at Sunday school, to ask your Sunday school teacher what begat meant. It meant similar to become the father of. But apart from that, the whole exercise seems a bit dry. But actually, it's quite important for the way in which Matthew's Gospel will unfold. That's why it's actually helpful, I think, for us at times to look at how that narrative is broken down. See, what's happening in these opening verses of Matthew's Gospel is that Matthew is placing Jesus within the dance of God's ongoing life and activity among the people of Israel. And that's really important, because when we forget Jesus was Jewish, we miss something really important in his identity. John's Gospel does the same with the first few verses of his Gospel, but it's much more in cosmic sort of terms. For Matthew, it's a story grounded in generations of real and identifiable people. We remember that Matthew is writing probably 50 years after Jesus' death, and he draws together oral and written stories from within the Christian communities of his day and the synagogues, and he's shaping his story to make a point. He wants his audience to see that Jesus is part of the ongoing story of the people of Israel. People who understood themselves as chosen by God to be a blessing to all nations. The genealogy functions as a really strong symbolic statement of this for Matthew, like it does elsewhere in Luke's Gospel. Interestingly, Mark's Gospel, the earliest, doesn't have any interest in it at all, but that's another story. Let's attend for a few moments to the genealogy itself. We can see that the narrative form breaks the story into three clear sections. And in verse 17, we see the basis for those divisions. Those last words I read. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation in Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Now what's important to notice here are a couple of things. Firstly, the ones who mark the beginning and ending of each section. Abraham, David, and the Messiah. Abraham, the father of the nation. David, the one that they call the king who led Israel into its golden age. And the Messiah, the anointed one of God. Now those among us who look for numerical patterns will have immediately noticed 3 lots of 14. So there's a certain symmetry in that. And if we push that a little bit more, 3 by 14 equals 6 by 7. Now we don't give as much attention these days to that kind of numerical structure, but the people of Matthew's Gospel did. And it's actually a really important part of the story. It's carefully crafted, especially so that when we remember 7 was regarded as the number of completeness, perfection even. And so Matthew has 6 times 7 to lead into the 7th age, the age or the story of the Messiah, the one in whom the presence and work of God among the people would be completed. So at the same time, the story in the genealogy is that of God has worked before the beginnings of Israel and now ushering in something new. Now up to this point, Matthew remains firmly within the fold of Jewish history. His departure comes in asserting, as he does for the rest of his gospel, that Jesus is the Messiah. So he places him. Matthew places Jesus in the line of the Messiah. What else do we notice about the genealogy? Well, for one thing, unlike most genealogies of its day, this one isn't exclusively male. Tamar in verse 3, Rahab and Ruth in verse 5, Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, verse 6, and Mary in verse 16 all get a mention. And importantly, they are not among the great matriarch figures of the scriptures. It's not Sarah or Rachel or Miriam or the others. These are women who wouldn't normally be automatic selections. And even more, they are all associated with sexual activity which was often frowned upon by holy men. And of course, men being the educated ones, and holy men in particular were the ones who wrote the stories. Okay, that's important. Tamar suffered rape and incest. Rahab was a prostitute. Ruth, at very least, slept very closely to Boaz in the grain shed. Bathsheba was the object of David's adultery. Mary was pregnant before marriage. Now we can assume nowadays all sorts of things about the sexual standards of the day, particularly those imposed on women by men. What we do know is that it's pretty clear that women ended up with the most of the blame for immorality of some kind sexually, whether it's active or they were there, so it was temptation, that kind of thing. And even when they had no power in the situation, no control, even when they were the object, in Bathsheba's case, for instance, well, try saying no to the king. Leaving all of that aside though, the genealogy in Matthew makes an important and quite radical statement for its time in including these women. Matthew's bold conviction is that they are included in the plan of God and valued for who they are. So we can see in the narrative and the symbolism of the genealogy in itself that some important statements are being made by Matthew in terms of Jesus in the history. But there's one more thing I want to highlight, and it's this. As a rule, people don't write the biography or the family history of a child. Not when it's a normal child. That's true in our time. I imagine it was even more the case in Jesus' day, particularly when so much of the population was illiterate, but even more tellingly, when the odds were stacked against a child making its 5th birthday. The kind of detail in Matthew here would have been known in the synagogues, because this was the history of the people after all. But to apply it to Jesus as a child would have involved a level of backward research unheard of, unless the child had gone on to do something in later life, or unless they were part of a royal line. So the inclusion of the genealogy in the beginning story in Matthew's Gospel is to alert us to the fact that this is an important story. But it's not an important story just because a baby was born. It's an important story because that baby grew up to make a dramatic impact on this world as an adult. Now that sounds very adult-centred, I know, but it is what it is. And in the purposes of Matthew's narrative, it's important. In my humble opinion, this is important for how we view Christmas and the celebration of Jesus' birth. The Christmas story belongs within the bigger story of Jesus' people across the generations. It also belongs with the stories of the grown-up Jesus, if it's to have meaning beyond the sentimental, and if it's to connect with the lives of real people. Sweet baby Jesus is sweet. But if that's where we leave the story, I'm not sure it's that helpful. You see, no one I know of loses interest in their children when they grow beyond infancy. But when you think about it, that's what happens with Jesus every year for most people. He gets packed away with the trees and the lights and the visa statements and the indigestion tablets to reappear next November and be cute all over again just because it's Christmas. But that's the Jesus of Hallmark. That's the Jesus of Maya and their friends, not the Jesus of the Gospels. That Jesus begins his story with birth into the Jewish faith and then proceeds to spend much of his adult life in that faith, challenging the way things are, ultimately to his death. And it became important for those who had followed him to understand that kind of life. And to help them understand it, they told stories of him. And those stories came together in gospel accounts like Matthew. So the genealogy and the baby stories are only a little bit about the baby Jesus. They're about the Jesus we see throughout Matthew's gospel and the others as well in ministry, in compassion, in courage and truth, and in getting stuck in to transform the realities of life among ordinary people. And when you think about it, it seems to me they're about the Jesus we see joining in the dance of life for God for all generations and for all people. And for that, I give thanks. In the name of the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen.